Section 18, page 83. These incidents had made the memory of his last talk with Madame Olenska so vivid to the young man that as the curtain fell on the parting of the two actors, his eyes filled with tears, and he stood up to leave the theatre. In doing so, he turned to the side of the house behind him, and saw the lady of whom he was thinking seated in a box with the Beauforts, Lawrence Lefferts, and one or two other men. He had not spoken with her alone since their evening together, and had tried to avoid being with her in company. But now their eyes met, and as Mrs. Beaufort recognized him at the same time, and made her languid little gesture of invitation, it was impossible not to go into the box. Beaufort and Lefferts made way for him, and after a few words with Mrs. Beaufort, who always preferred to look beautiful and not to have to talk, Archer seated himself behind Madame Olenska. There was no one else in the box but Mr. Sillerton Jackson, who was telling Mrs. Beaufort in a confidential undertone about Mrs. Lemma Stutter's last Sunday reception. In parentheses, where some people reported that there had been dancing. Under cover of this circumstantial narrative, to which Mrs. Beaufort listened with her perfect smile, and her head at just the right angle to be seen in profile from the stalls, Madame Olenska turned and spoke in a low voice. "Do you think," she asked, glancing toward the stage, "he will send her a bunch of yellow roses tomorrow morning?" Archer reddened, and his heart gave a leap of surprise. He had called only twice on Madame Olenska, and each time he had sent her a box of yellow roses, and each time without a card. She had never before made any allusion to the flowers, and he supposed she had never thought of him as a sender. Now her sudden recognition of the gift, and her association it with the tender leave-taking on the stage, filled with him an agitated pleasure. "I was thinking of that too. I was going to leave the theatre in order to take the picture away with me," he said. To his surprise, her color rose, reluctantly and duskly. She looked down at the mother-of-pearl opera glass in her smoothly gloved hands, and said, after a pause, "What do you do while May is away?" "I stick to my work," he answered, faintly annoyed by the question. In obedience to a long-established habit, the Vallons had left the previous week for the St. Augustine, where, out of regard for the supposed susceptibility of Mrs. Vallon's bronchial tubes, they always spent the latter part of the winter. Mr. Welland has a mild and silent man, with no opinions but with many habits. With these habits none might interfere, and one of them demanded that his wife and daughter should always go with him on his annual journey to the south. To preserve an unbroken domesticity was essential to his peace of mind. He wouldn't have known where his hair brushes were, or how to provide stamps for his letters, if Mrs. Welland had not been there to tell him. As all the members of the family adored each other, and as Mr. Welland was the central object of their idolatry, it never occurred to his wife and May to let him go to the St. Augustine alone, and his sons, who were both in the law and couldn't leave New York during the winter, always joined him for Easter and traveled back with him. It was impossible for Archer to discuss the necessity of May's accompanying her father. The repetitions of the Mingotts family physician was largely based on the attack of pneumonia, which Mr. Welland had never had, and his insistence on St. Augustine was therefore inflexible. Originally, it had been intended that May's engagement shouldn't be announced till her return from Florida, and the fact that it had been made known sooner couldn't be expected to alter Mr. Welland's plans. Archer would have liked to join the travelers and have a few weeks of sunshine and boating with his betrothed, but he too was bound by custom and conventions. Little arduous as his professional duties were, he would have been convicted of frivolity by the whole Mingot clan if he had suggested asking for a holiday in midwinter, and he accepted May's departure with the resignation which he perceived would have been be the one of the principal constituents of married life. He was conscious that Madame Alaska was looking at him under lowered lids. "I have done what you wished, what you advised," she said abruptly. "Ah, I'm glad," he returned, embarrassed by her broaching the subject at such moment. "I understand that you were right," she went on a little breathlessly. "But sometimes life is difficult, perplexing." "I know. And I wanted to tell you that I do feel you were right, and that I'm grateful to you," she ended, lifting her opera glass quickly to her eyes, as the door of the box opened and Beeford's resonant voice broke in on them. Archer stood up and left the box and the theater. Only the day before he had received a letter from May Welland, in which, with characteristic candor, she had asked him to be kind to Ellen in their absence. "She likes you and admires you so much, and, though she doesn't show it, she is still very lonely and unhappy. I don't think Granny understands her, or Uncle Lovell Mingott either. They really think she is much worldlier and fonder of society than she is. And I can quite see that New York must seem dull to her, though the family won't admit it. I think she's been used to lots of things we haven't got. Wonderful music, and picture shows, and celebrities, artists and others, and all the clever people you admire. Granny can understand her wanting anything but lots of dinners and clothes. But I can see that you are almost the only person in New York who can talk to her about what she really cares for." His voice May, how he had loved her for that letter. But he had not meant to act on it. He was too busy to begin with, and he didn't care, as an engaged man, to play too conspicuously the part of Madame Alaska's champion. He had an idea that she knew how to take care of herself a good deal better than the ingenious May imagined. She had Beaufort at her feet, Miss van der Leyden hovering above her like a protecting deity, and any number of candidates, in parentheses, Lawrence Lefferts among them, waiting their opportunity in the middle distance. Yet he never saw her or exchanged a word with her without feeling that, after all, May's ingenuousness almost amounted to a gift of divination. Ellen Alaska was lonely and she was unhappy. Chapter 14. As he came out into the lobby, Archer ran across his friend Ned Vincent, the only one among what Janey called his clever people, with whom he cared to probe into things a little deeper than the average level of club and chophouse banter. He had caught sight, across the house, of Vincent's shabby, round-shouldered back, and had once noticed his eyes turned toward the Beaufort box. Two men shook hands, and Vincent proposed a walk at a little German restaurant around the corner. Archer, who wasn't in the mood for the kind of talk they were likely to get there, declined on the plea that he had the work to do at home, and Vincent said, "Oh, well, so have I for that matter, and I will be the industrious apprentice too." They strolled along together, and presently Vincent said, "Look here, what I'm really after is the name of the dark lady in that swell box of yours. With the Beauforts, wasn't she? The one with your friend Lefferts seems so smitten by." Archer, he couldn't have said why, was slightly annoyed. What the devil did Ned Vincent want with Ellen Alaska's name? And above all, why did he couple it with the Lefferts? It was unlike Vincent to manifest such curiosity, but after all, Archer remembered he was a journalist. "It is not for an interview, I hope," he laughed. "Well, not for the press, just for myself," Vincent rejoined. "The fact is she is a neighbor of mine. Queer quarter for such a beauty to settle in. And she's been awfully kind to my little boy, who fell down her area chasing his kitten, and gave himself a nasty cut. She rushed in bareheaded, carrying him in her arms, with his knee all beautifully bandaged, and was so sympathetic and beautiful that my wife was too dazzled to ask her name." A pleasant glow dilated Archer's heart. There was nothing extraordinary in the tale. Any woman would have done as much for a neighbor's child. But it was just like Ellen, he felt, to have rushed in bareheaded, carrying the boy in her arms, and to have dazzled poor Mrs. Vincent into forgetting to ask who she was. That is Countess Olenska, a granddaughter of old Mr. Mingott's. Wow, a countess, whistled Ned Vincent. Well, I didn't know countesses were so neighborly. Mingotts ain't. They will be, if you let them. Ah, well, it was their old interminable argument as to the obstinate unwillingness of the clever people to frequent the fashionable, and both men knew that there was no use in prolonging it. I wonder, Vincent broke off, how a countess happens to live in our slum. Because she doesn't care a hang about where she lives, or about any of our little social signposts, said Archer, with a secret pride in his own picture of her. Being in the bigger places, I suppose, the other commented. Well, here is my corner. He slouched off across Broadway, and Archer stood looking after him and musing on his last words. Ned Vincent had those flashes of penetration. They were the most interesting thing about him, and always made Archer wonder why they had all allowed him to accept failure so stoutly at an age when most men are still struggling. Archer had known that Vincent had a wife and child, but he had never seen them. The two men always meet at the Sanctuary, or at some haunt of journalists and theatrical people, such as the restaurant where Vincent had proposed to go for a buck. He had given Archer to understand that his wife was an invalid, which might be true of the poor lady, or might merely mean that she was lacking in social gifts, or evening clothes, or in both. Vincent himself had a savage abhorrence of social observances. Archer, who dressed in the evening because he thought it cleaner and more comfortable to do so, and who had never stopped to consider that cleanliness and comfort are two of the costliest items in a modest budget, regarded Vincent's attitude as part of the boring bohemian pose that always made fashionable people who changed their clothes without talking about it, and were not forever harping on the number of servants one kept seem so much simpler and less self-conscious than the others. Nevertheless, he was always stimulated by Vincent, and whenever he caught sight of the journalist's lean bearded face and melancholy eyes, he would root him out of his corner and carry him off for a long talk. End of the section, page 87.